Hi, can you hear me? Okay, hi, good afternoon or good morning, everyone, depending upon where you are. My name is Ed Silverman, and I'm the Pharmalot columnist and a senior writer here at STAT. And I want to thank you for tuning in, showing up today. We have an exciting, if sobering topic to discuss for a bit, antimicrobial resistance, which, as you know, is mounting health issue. It's not going away with a lot of effort and forethought. And to discuss some of those efforts, we have with us today Dr. John Rex, who's editor-in-chief at AMR Solutions, a must-read newsletter and website if you want to know some of the latest developments on what is going on in industry and policymakers. He's also the chief medical officer at F2G, which is looking for solutions of its own to the resistance problem. John, hi, are you there?
Bingo, we're on.
Hi.
Hey, good to see you.
So, you know a ton about this. As I was saying before we got the show started, John could talk about some of the stuff in his sleep, and I know that firsthand because we've talked on and off for quite some time. I reach out often when I have a question about something that I find vexing or just hard to figure out if I want to explain it to others. And so, but I want to just start off to give everybody a sense of the magnitude of the problem that we're all facing. And this is really a global problem. A couple of years ago, before the pandemic, the World Health Organization issued a report that estimated 700,000 people die annually from antimicrobial resistance. And that could rise to 10 million by 2050 if there's nothing done. Meanwhile, in the United States alone, there are more than 2.8 million antibiotic resistant infections each year and 35,000 deaths from those infections. And that's according to the CDC. So you stop and think about it, those figures aren't really the most up to date, and they're estimates in any event. Now, of course, we've started going through and hopefully come to grips with COVID-19, but that's only worsened the problem. And John, I'd like to ask you a little bit about some perspective on just how bad COVID has made the AMR problem. Again, it's a global issue, just like the pandemic. And I'm wondering where we're at compared to just a couple of years ago, for instance.
Yeah. Good questions. Those numbers that you cite are probably conservative. And part of the problem is with counting it, because when people die, the first thing you write down isn't always that it was due to resistant bacterial infection. They may have had other things that put them in. So they had a car wreck, they wound up in the ICU. And the resistant bacterial infection made their care a lot more difficult. But ultimately, you may write down, well, no, they died of trauma. Well, yeah, but you might have pulled them through if they didn't have that difficult bacterial infection that occurred in the middle of it. So I think those numbers are probably low. And there was a really interesting paper that came out from the Indian Council of Medical Research, where this is a group where India has these government-run hospitals, and they went to 10 big hospitals last fall during the early days, or the sort of India's first COVID outbreak, and they looked at the secondary infections in those ICUs, and the mortality when you had a secondary bacterial infection went up about fivefold, from about 10% to about 50%. And they had a lot of highly resistant bacteria in their survey. So the carbapenem resistant Acinetobacter and Klebsiella were really quite striking. So you look at all that, you say, boy, there really is a serious challenge. And and any of us could wind up in the ICU. This is not something that, other than geography, these bacteria really don't distinguish, and they certainly do move around the world. So I think COVID has given us all an awareness of the consequence of infections, and I think there probably was some overuse of antibacterials in in countries that didn't, in some areas, for people admitted with respiratory disease due to COVID because people were spooked about what if I get it wrong. But but still, through all that, the need for drug, for legitimate need for drug, and people who got real infections, there's really been something of a real, the resistance crisis continues to plod forward and expand itself slowly, and we all need to be doing something about it.
One of the before I ask you this question, I just want to remind everyone, we will be taking questions. There's a little Q&A button at the bottom of the screen. So if you have a question, type that in. We'll either get to it as we move along, or we'll save them for the end, depending upon where we are in the conversation. So getting back to what you were just saying about things to do and how to cope with it, stewardship is a big buzzword. It's not a new one. And it's looked at as not a salvation, but a tool, a useful tool, but it has its shortcomings. I know that I was talking to some folks earlier this year. While the CDC has a system in place, it varies. The surveillance data for antibiotic use varies among hospitals in the United States, and the follow-up is piecemeal sometimes. And it's hard to determine what's happening. Sometimes it doesn't follow patients who are discharged. So it makes me wonder, to what extent can stewardship really work, or is it just unable to keep up with the pace of infections? And what else about stewardship is working, but also, in your view, not working?
Yeah. The word stewardship, let me just be clear that we're here talking about the positive side of stewardship as opposed to the negative side. The negative side would be, I don't want to spend money on something expensive. And that's a version of stewardship, but it isn't really what we're after. I think it's better to think of stewardship as the right drug for the right patient. And sometimes that's a generic drug, and sometimes that's something really specialized. But you always want to be using the correct drug, and more importantly, or equally important, having access to the correct drug. The availability of the correct drug is remarkably uneven around the world. We have Kevin Otterson has just recently penned a paper that I'm one of the co-authors on that looks at the availability of the higher end drugs globally and how long it takes for the drugs to become available. Right now in the US, we've got a fair number of the higher end drugs, but you just go to Europe and you start not having them. And you go outside of that and the lag can be even longer than that. So the stewardship thing, you've got to tie it to knowing what you need to use and then having access to that drug. And I think that there have been good educational efforts. I'll point at like the WHO's system called the AWARE system, AWARE. I believe it says for access, watch. What is the others? AWARE. Access, watch, and reserve. That's it. Access, watch. So access is you need to have it. Watch means it's around, but let's be careful about using it. And reserve means no, only a specialist can get at it. But you actually lay them out. And you say, and you should have the ability to get them when you need them. So I think that those models are influencing the way people think. And CDC's done a good job in the United States, as has the ECDC in Europe, of spreading the word about don't use them when you need them. That's sort of the message to Dr. Mom about kid with otitis doesn't need an antibiotic, but do use them when you need them. That's the flip side. And I think that's what we're all driving towards is correct access globally.
Tell me about the bad stewardship for a moment. You mentioned that at the top. We don't want to spend on whatever. Yeah. What's the problem there, and how is that worsening things?
Well, that's a classic challenge with all drugs, right? You don't want to spend more money than you have to, and the newer agents are necessarily relatively expensive on a per use basis. And if you can use something that's less expensive, you want to do that. And budgets in hospitals tend to be siloed. The pharmacy budget if you blow the pharmacy budget by letting somebody have a $10,000 a day antibiotic for a couple of weeks, you're the pharmacy manager. You get, that's your budget. Whereas the budget for the whole hospital doesn't reflect the fact that the patient in bed A in the ICU had a very resistant bacteria. Because we treated them right away with a good drug that got rid of that, patient B did not get an infection, nor did patient C, nor did patient D. But the value to patients B, C, and D is not reflected in the pharmacy budget. I mean, we don't think that way. So it gets into this, what we call the non-use value of antibiotics. It's an interesting twist. We hope we're going to talk in a minute about the new payer models. But in the UK, NICE, the Health Technology Assessor, commissioned the University of York to do a research project in which they looked at the role of antibiotics when they're not being given to somebody. So stay with me for a second. So I'm going to take a little detour for a moment. And we're going to think about fires and fire extinguishers. So when you have a fire in your house, what you need to do is put that fire out right away so it doesn't spread to the rest of the house or doesn't spread to the adjacent apartment. So have you used a fire extinguisher today, Ed?
No, but in the hall closet.
Yeah, it's in the hall closet, isn't it? Right. Are you in a building? You've had your fire extinguisher handy. And so the only part you didn't use was the part that got you wet. So you actually have, because it's what makes you safe to be where you are. So antibiotics are like fire extinguishers. Somebody's on fire, I put them out, spread to the next person. So this is an example of the transmission value of a new antibiotic. And the University of York identified 5 values, and the acronym is STEDI, and I'm sure they won't be able to say what each one of them are, but spectrum, transmission, enablement, diversity, and insurance. Actually, I did say it. And transmission is the easiest one because there's a real, what the economists would call it, a positive externality. It's the value that I'm patient B. I just got value because patient A, money got spent on patient A, put out their fire. And it's really interesting to see how that plays out because what York has said to NICE is that in theory, a good new high-end antibiotic, even if you only used 1 dose or 0 doses in a year, is worth up to 10 million pounds a year to the UK just to have it available. Knowing that if the outbreak did occur, you could treat it, has a value to society as a whole of 10 million pounds. So this is the back end question of the whole access budget thing, is that at some point somebody has to pay for the fire extinguishers. Otherwise you don't have them.
Before we go to the payer models, we have a couple of questions. So let's see if we can't get through what we have here. We have someone asked, what has been the biggest impediment to developing the new classes of antimicrobials?
Finding good novelty in the antimicrobial space is hard. And it's hard because antibiotics have the quirky property of being drugs that kill things. There are actually only 2 classes of drugs that kill things: antibiotics and anti-cancer therapies. Everything else, think about antihypertensive or some for the heart, tends to be modifying a human system a little bit. It's a little tweak to your beta receptors. It's a little nudge to the system, to the immune system. With antibiotics, it's a big gun, and antibiotics tend to be toxic. And you tend to need large doses of them because you've got to get them into the bacteria through the bloodstream, and the bacteria aren't interested in dying. So we sometimes joke that it's easy to find things that kill bacteria. Steam and fire and bleach are fantastic antibacterials. They're not good drugs. And so finding something that is precise enough to reach all the way through your bloodstream, get into your lungs, and kill just the bacteria and not harm anything else along the way is hard. The size of just the very doses tell you this. What's the daily dose of imipenem? 6 grams a day, 2 grams every 8 hours. What's the daily dose of, I don't know, atorvastatin for your blood pressure, for your lipids? 10 milligrams, 20 milligrams? So it's all about this problem of getting in. And then the other thing that has really hurt the area is the fact that right now, one of the best ways to lose your shirt financially is to start an antibacterial company and invent a new drug and go out of business because you got it approved. Because getting a new drug approved until we fix the payer models is a super way to burn $50 to $100 million.
Next question, which we started talking about hospitals before. Could the U.S. require hospitals to report antibiotic data to the CDC?
I would.
How might such a requirement be designed? Do you have any insight into that?
I don't have strong insights there. I know that when I was an epidemiologist, we did some voluntary reporting, participated in some CDC systems, and I don't know what the rules are, but there's no obvious reason why the data couldn't be aggregated. And there's a lot of interest these days in accumulating resistance, susceptibility testing data and aggregating it. There are a number of projects. For Welcome Trust, for example, has a project right now where the goal is to develop a sort of a global data set. WHO has their program, the GLASS program. So why not?
Let's move on to what's happening with payers. You said you wanted to touch base. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, your volume went down to almost zip, but now you're back.
Okay, sorry. You wanted to pivot toward payers. What did you have in mind before I move on? Because I have some questions about incentives, developers, and what's happening with industry.
Yeah, I'm just going to read this question because I think it's really spot on. How can small biotech companies be incentivized to develop an antibiotic when knowing that a new class will be kept in reserve with almost no ROI? Right? Are we seeing changes yet that's going to fix it? So this is the core problem of new antibacterials. We have seen two really clear examples of this recently. Achaogen, and let me just talk about Achaogen because I think that's the easiest one to look at. Achaogen developed a new aminoglycoside called plazomicin, and they demonstrated that it works when the aminoglycosides, when other aminoglycosides don't work. They did a study in urinary tract infection, showed that it works just as well as a standard comparator, and they can show in vitro that it still works when the other aminoglycosides don't work. So they're able to clearly show that. That company went out of business. They couldn't sell the compound. The total sales were effectively nil. And it's helpful for a moment to envision the following scenario to realize just what the real costs are. Let's pretend that I gave you plazomicin. Here it is. It's approved in the United States, and it could be approved in Europe. We'll come to that in a moment. That's a really good part of the story. And here, the factory's over here. Here's the address, and here are the people who make the drug. I'm going to hand it all to you. It's like a car full of gas that I put in your driveway and say, here, Ed, have the keys. The thing to know about your new car is that over the next 10 years, you need $350 million just to keep the car idling in the driveway. You're going to need $25 million a year to just make the drug. It's a sterile injectable. You got to run the plants, expensive stuff. And you're going to need probably $100 million for your post-approval commitments. For example, if you would like to go on and accept the approval that Europe is offering you, you'll have to agree to do a pediatric investigational program, which will cost you $50 million. And in fact, when Achaogen went out of business, Cipla bought Achaogen. And then about a year later, we wondered what was going on with the EMA. And there's a fascinating letter posted on the EMA website from Cipla. Cipla says, "Dear EMA, thank you very much for offering to approve our drug. We're not going to accept it because you have asked us to do two things. You want some manufacturing fixes, which probably we could do, but you also would like us to spend $50 million on a pediatric program. Makes no sense. We can't do this. Love, Cipla." Okay. So here, and yet you'd like to have the drug around. And wow. So the fix that's coming is that we have now spent 10 years talking about all the different ways you could fix this problem, and trying to avoid magical thinking. Okay, we're trying to be really concrete and do stuff that you can do in the real world. And there was a wonderful project called Drive AB that we ran from 2014 to 2017, where a group of 100 of us got together and we talked and we fought, we argued, and we taught each other. And we looked at all the possible ways you could deal with the problem that Achaogen was facing. Here's a drug. This is a question we've got a new drug. I've just got it approved. My sales are zip. I'm going out of business. How can you fix that? So actually, the Drive AB report's interesting. In the back, there's a list of 35 or 40 possible mechanisms you could use, and they're all graded, and each one's critiqued, pro, con, what's good, what's bad. And what emerges out of it is that there's no perfect answer, but there are answers that are better than others. And the key that we need to implement globally are four things. On the push side, we need to do what we're doing through CARB-X and through global coordinators like the AMR, the global AMR hub in Berlin.
I ask you to back up. What when you say push, just for the benefit
Oh, sorry. Excuse me, going too
I
fast.
have to assume some folks are not familiar with a push.
Yeah, I apologize. And ladder of inference. Thank you.
No,
So what we said was we need push and pull incentives. So push incentives are things that cause you to start a small company. So big grant. Here, have $10 million to go pursue your idea and do the first block of work. And that's what you can get out of some of the big funds like CARB-X and Novo Repair Impact Fund can provide money. We also need a way for the community, the global community, to know what's going on, the so-called pipeline coordination activities. And then we have that from this group in Berlin that was founded by the G20 a couple of years ago, the AMR, the Global AMR Hub. The WHO puts out pipeline reviews, as do Pew Trust at regular intervals. So it's possible to know what's going on. So those are the two kinds of push things that we've needed. But what we then have to have is pull. We have to have the ability to pay for a drug even when we don't use it. We have to have a way to cause the company to make enough money to stay in business, cause the right companies to make enough money to stay in business, and that's pull. And the two pull incentives that were identified, or think of them as big pull and little pull. Big pull is what you do to get your brand new drugs on the market. So what you need to do in the big pull model is when somebody gets a cool new drug, and that's cool is an important idea. We're going to come back to why you have to be very picky. A cool new drug, we as a community globally should pay that innovator between $2 and $4 billion over 10 years.
Where did that estimate come from?
So the estimate 2 to 4 billion comes out of work done at Drive AB, the modeling done there. There's a list on my website of the different sources, but when you start to look at all the costs, it's $1.3 billion to get the drug invented on average. That's out of one data set. And then another $350 million to run it for 10 years. And so that's $1.7 billion on average to bring a molecule to creation and keep the car idling in the driveway for 10 years. You want people have to be able to make some money off of that, and thus the number $2 to $4 billion is the global reward number. And the UK actually set that benchmark. Here's how. The UK, I mentioned York, why they did that investigation. Well, they were interested in how we're going to buy a new drug for the UK. And the UK has said they have a pilot project going on where they're going to buy two drugs for 10 million pounds each per year for 10 years. They've picked out the two new drugs. They went through a process of saying, what are the characteristics we want? It was a point scoring system, innovation, impact, a bunch of other stuff like that. They picked out these two drugs, cefiderocol and ceftazidime-avibactam, and they're negotiating the final annual payment, but we're hoping it's close to 10 million pounds. They said that's the notional upper limit of the payment. 10 million pounds a year for 10 years, that's 100 million pounds. The UK is 3% of the G20. Scale it by 33, that's 3.3 billion pounds. Turn that into dollars, $4 billion. So the UK, with their pilot, has implicitly said that $4 billion is the global value of an interesting new antibiotic. And Drive AB's modeling has said that if you set a reward in that range, suddenly the whole economics become the same as being a cancer company. So instead of this question about there's no ROI, Actually, now we've made the ROI for a really cool new antibiotic the same as for a really cool new anti-cancer drug. And that's the goal of the pull incentives. That's the big pull. Little pull is the problem of the availability of old, generic, off-patent antibiotics that still have value. Take penicillin G, plain old penicillin G, the one we've been using forever. The perfect drug for neurosyphilis, the perfect drug for a variety of things. How many doses have I personally prescribed in my lifetime? Half a dozen, or courses, because every so often you need Pen-G. Can you go get Pen-G right now? No, because nobody makes it, because there's not enough use of it. And yet it would be very helpful to have access to certain. So little pull is the idea of contracting with some manufacturer to just make penicillin G and have it be available. So big pull, little pull are the things that we need to put in place. And in the United States, the Pasteur Act, all in capital letters, Pasteur Act, is the legislative tool that's going to create the equivalent of the UK's 10 million pounds a year for 10 years. So Pasteur was recently reintroduced into Congress by both houses. And we're hoping it's going to get passed as part of the Cures 2.0 Act. And I'm sorry, I can't name everybody who's been behind it. I should have refreshed my brain on that.
Bennett is one.
Yeah, Bennett, and I'm sorry, it's been his partner, the Republican senator. I'm blanking out. I'm sorry, we'll look it up in a second. Because I want to give everybody credit for all the work they've done. They introduced it last fall and got some feedback, and they reworked it, and they've recently reintroduced it, and the goal is to get it to pass as part of Cures 2.0. So,
Well, one of the questions I have is that this requires a lot of forethought and a commitment to funds, right? How do you convince other governments to pick up on this? And how do you make sure that, like when I talked to some staffers on Capitol Hill in Washington, one of the issues that came up last year when the Pasteur Act was initially introduced was that there's concern of giving money away to pharma companies.
right.
And so whether we're talking, yes, we have a different healthcare system here in the US, but I think some of these concerns translate or live across borders. So how do you get past some of these obstacles? And to what extent, and I'm sort of setting you up for an easy part of the answer, but to what extent does should COVID factor into that? I mean, there's some intellectual leaps here that I think are actually substantive, particularly for poorer nations, right? Or even middle nations.
Yeah. And let me just pick up COVID for a second, because I think COVID teaches us, if you play a little bit with COVID, and it's an idea, you can get a really powerful lesson out of it. So let's do a little thought experiment. You and I get in a time machine. We're going to go back to 2010. And we've heard about SARS and MERS, two of the beta coronaviruses. And we've also learned that there are people who get an upper respiratory illness from beta coronaviruses. And you and I decided to start a company because we say, we think a therapeutic for SARS and MERS would be a cool thing to have. So you and I get busy, and we spend the next 8 years developing our new therapeutic for beta coronaviruses as a family. And we study some people with our respiratory illnesses, and we do some human challenge models, and we get approved. It's January 2018, and you and I bring to the world our new beta coronavirus drug. What are our sales in 2018? Square root of zero, right? What are our sales in 2019? Can we stay in business? No, but now this is the part that, so quick answer. What's the drug worth today? Now, your temptation is going to be at some large number. But in fact, no, because in January of 2020, when we hear about Wuhan, we call them up and say, Wuhan, we got a thing. And we ship them some drugs. And they put the fire out. Well, the fire got to New York as well, and Paris, but we put the fire out there. We end up treating, 20 or 30,000 people with our new drug. The fire gets put out for the most part. Every time it pops up again, we say, here comes John and Ed's drug. Just take some of this. So maybe we sell a few $100 million worth. Do we sell $1 trillion worth? No. But what's the value to the globe, to the global economy of that fire extinguisher?
That's huge.
Huge.
Right.
And so So in terms of a way to talk to the policy folks, talk to ministers of finance in a way that is visceral. This is the value of a fire extinguisher. The building didn't burn down, but you've got to be willing to recognize the value of something that sounds so boring, and that's prevention and preparedness. Oh, it sounds boring. And we're going to give money to a pharmaceutical company about this? Well, yeah, actually, because that's how your economy stays safe. So, but one of the tricks for this, for in the coming Pasteur Act era, so I hope it passes, is the Pasteur Act says that we need to create a committee who will lay out the rules of the road for what gets rewarded. Because the Pasteur Act is offering to pay for a really interesting new antibiotic between $750 million and $3 billion from the US government taxpayer pocket over 10 years. We're not going to pay that for something that's boring, for something that's we've already got kind of one or two or something of. We're going to pay it for something that's, I want a new fire extinguisher, something really different. And so this is the message that we have to deliver kind of in two directions. To the finance ministers, or to this case, the people are concerned about overpaying, say, no, we're going to buy only really cool stuff. When you see it, you're going to say, wow, I want one of those. To the R&D community, it's going to be, this isn't the way it used to be when you could have small incremental innovations. We do not want another beta-lactam unless you do something exceptional. It has to sing and dance in a way that's compelling. And so this is the idea that we will buy interesting new fire extinguishers when everybody agrees that they can see why that fire extinguisher is so cool.
We have a couple of questions. Let's try to get to those.
What have we got here?
Yeah, let's see. Oh, here we go.
Well, I mean, real quick, somebody asked about phage therapies. I think phage therapies are really interesting. It's clear that they can kill bacteria. The problem is turning them into a drug. It's a variation on my steam, fire, and bleach joke from earlier. You can sometimes use phage to kill bacteria, but how can you give me, Dr. Busy, a tube full of phage that's going to work on my patient? That's the trick. And there's been a lot of work on that over the past 10 to 15 years. And the rules of the road for a phage therapy are not different from anything else. You've got to be able to make it consistently and tell us how to use it. In the case of phage, it isn't always the same thing. So you got to explain how you're going to make it's not the same thing, and yet it is qualitatively the same thing, and it's the right same thing. I think this is for me, phage is as much a manufacturing issue as it is anything else, because you certainly, those pictures of phage causing bacteria to go explode, that's real. That's how they work. Microbiome therapeutics, same thing. The problem with some of these actually, it's worth saying that briefly. The reason that sort of penicillin-like drugs, and I mean it in sort of the sense of small molecule therapy, not necessarily a penicillin pharmacophore, just a drug that kills bacteria quickly. The reason that those are easy to study is because they kill bacteria quickly, and you can get a very sharp endpoint with them. If you look at some of the non-drug alternatives, like I'm going to manipulate the microbiome, what's interesting, and scientifically I am intrigued by that. Or I'm going to manipulate this is even better. I'm going to manipulate your immune system. So the way that I'm going to help your infection do better is I'm going to give you a good antibiotic, and I'm going to reach in and tweak your immune system so you have a better response. The problem with those approaches is that the antibiotics, when they work, are so good that there's not much room left. If the antibiotic gives you most of the response, there's this tiny little window left for the alternative to make an improvement in. And that makes it difficult to develop these non-traditional alternatives. I'm scientifically, I think they're fascinating. I just have to say, developmentally, they're really hard to manage.
Another question, to what extent are novel antifungals important as well as novel antibiotics?
Okay. So I think novel antifungals are important, and I would encourage everybody to read the June issue of Scientific American. I'm going to plug Myron McKenna here for a second. Myron wrote a marvelous piece, and actually she's the cover story. The cover of the June issue is the next deadly plague, and in her paper she writes about Candida auris. I think she writes about azole-resistant aspergillosis. I know she writes about coccidioidomycosis. And it's a really good survey of the fact that it's not just bacteria that are scary as well. So we have in the antifungal universe, basically it reduces for good systemic antifungals. And here I'm not talking about antifungals for toenail infections. That's a different challenge. But for systemic fungal infections, the kind that can get you in trouble if you can cancer therapy, there are really only three classes of drugs. Amphotericin, which is sort of one drug in different packages by itself, the echinocandins and the azoles. And the classes tend to live and die together. So if the azole doesn't work for your fungus, if azole 1 doesn't work, then usually azole 2 doesn't work either. And so it's very limited. And so we actually do need some novelty. And so my disclaimer here is I'm the chief medical officer for a company that actually is pursuing a novel antifungal. So it's just why I sort of had these details in my head. But it's an important area, and you have one of these infections, particularly if you live in Southern California and you have valley fever, which is a real deal. The need for new drugs is real.
One thing that we haven't discussed, and I'm just wondering what your take on this is, the big pharma companies largely exited this field some time ago. They've gotten beat on regularly for having done that. And last year, with some hoopla, there's this new AMR Action Fund, I think the name is, $1 billion. They're pooling together. They're going to look for 3 to 4 novel antibiotics over the next 10 years. But I haven't gotten a lot of clarity. That's because they haven't really discussed how that's going to play out, who has what stake and who does what, who invests what, who owns what. So that's a little bit confusing. And I'm also wondering, well, is this really great shakes? I mean, I don't want to sound negative, but only 4 in 10 years with all that money, all that power behind them? Shouldn't they be doing more?
Yep. So thank you for asking that question. So I was part of the birth of the idea here and basically the AMR Action Fund is $1 billion approximately, most of it from medium and large pharma, some of it also from private and government sources. The European Investment Bank has put in some money, for example. And what the fund wants to do, and here's my next disclaimer, I was recently appointed as the chair of the fund's scientific advisory board. So we're going to be tasked with picking out the drugs that we're going to spend money on in the following way. We would like to identify drugs that are cool enough to potentially earn a good D-linked reward from something like Pasteur and support their phase 2 and phase 3 work so that they can get to approval. And the goal is to have several new antibiotics to go, as you said, 2 to 4, 3 to 4 new, interesting new antibiotics on the market by 2030. The other thing the Action Fund is going to be doing is going back to this payer problem. It's going to be saying to the governments of the world over and over again, here comes a really cool new drug. You can see why this would be cool, and you can't have it unless you change your payment scheme. You're going to have to get involved in a de-linked reimbursement model. Otherwise, the drug won't be there for you. And this is why. And we've now been working since 2009 to figure this out. It's actually we have now spent a decade getting the language right, and we know how to tell this story. I'm not an economist, but I can briefly channel one. I can talk about positive externalities and negative externalities, and explain why you need to think of this as a classic economic problem. And this is why you need these solutions. And my colleagues, Kevin Arson and Raman Lakshman Ryan, I mean, this whole group of us who have really, really worked on the language. The fire extinguisher idea came out of all that conversation. 10 years ago, I wouldn't have known to say that antibiotics are the fire extinguishers of medicine, but now I do. Uh, and so that's what we're working to change through the AMR Action Fund. It's money to help companies get there, and it's the messaging around why we're bringing these drugs to you. And you say only a few. Well, in truth, if you look at the pipeline, innovation at the level we seek is not something that happens every day. And we need to have companies be willing to take a risk. And the way you do that is by providing an adequate reward down the road. And that's what makes we want it to be economically equivalent to start a new cancer company. How many little cancer companies are there right now, Ed?
Don't have a good number, but it's a lot.
It's a lot. Why? It's because the reward is big if you're the winner.
A lot of incentive, right?
And pharma's used to taking the technical risk if the reward is there. So with new antibacterials, the idea is take the technical risk, kids, bet big, find us something really different, and we will reward you. And that's the messaging we have to create.
We have time for just one more question. Here it is. Should an effort be made to reduce unnecessary antibiotic prescribing today, or do you consider the damage done and we should move on to focusing on finding new medications?
That's a softball. We should always be working on correct use, not too much, not too little, baby bear's porridge, okay? Because the drugs we've got are still good drugs. We need to not wear them out. The few drugs that we're going to invent, I mean, if we have, 3 or 4, if we had 4 really interesting new drugs every 10 years, that would be an extraordinary number, I think, given how difficult it is. What if we only have a couple? Well, we need to take care of those. Are precious jewels. We need to take care of them. So the effort in training people to correctly use the drugs we've got translates to using correctly the new drugs. We want everybody to have this burned into their brain. We want every medical student to get this burned into his or her brain, that you don't unnecessarily use, but you do use when you should.
Well, thank you, John. With that, we have to wrap up. Again, John Rex, thank you very much for your time and your insights. It was a pleasure chatting with you today. And I want to thank the audience out there, wherever you are, for tuning in. Again, we host Stat Plus Conversations on Tuesdays around 1 p.m. Eastern Time each week. So be sure to sign up for our next on July 27th. And we hope you join us then. And thanks again, everyone. It was nice to see you. Hope you got something out of this. And John, thank you again.
It was a pleasure, Ed. Thanks